Hi, my name's Tanya Harris and I'm from Sydney, Australia, and it's great to be with you at the APTO conference, albeit virtually. Let me introduce myself a little bit first. I am an ordained minister with the Australian Christian Churches, have been in ministry for a number of years and have recently completed my PhD with Alpha Crucis College on the topic of the Pentecostal Revelatory experience. And the paper I want to bring to you today draws on the findings of my PhD, and we're looking particularly at the role of revelatory experience in relation to the mission to heal. It's such a great conference topic. But before we go any further, we need to define what I mean by the revelatory experience. I first came across this experience in the Pentecostal church at 21 years old, and I began to hear Pentecostal Christians talking a lot about hearing God's voice. Now, obviously in Christianity, there is a belief in a revelatory God. It's founded on that. We see it all the way through the scriptures. But today, what we mean when we talk about hearing God's voice means different things to different people depending on your church tradition. Typically, we find that in the conservative sectors of evangelicalism under the banner of Protestantism, that when we talk about hearing from God, hearing God's voice, it's usually equated with reading the scriptures or hearing the scriptures expounded through preaching and the like. But when we talk about the Pentecostal expression, it includes those modes, but Pentecostals have a worldview that anticipates contemporary experience to be analogous to that of the early church. So when it comes to hearing the voice of the Spirit, for the Pentecostal, that usually is equated to direct and unmediated and spontaneous encounters with the voice of the Spirit. Experientially, that looks like dreams, visions, voices, and sensory impressions and the like. It contains the element of revelation, so it could include the possibility of information that I may know, but also information that I do not know. So information that relates to the spiritual realm or some previously unknown information or information that relates to the future. And because of this dynamic in the Pentecostal experience, the experience itself tends to be more volatile and more subject to pastoral fallout in the Pentecostal church. What I would like to do in this paper is to look specifically at the function of revelatory experience in the data that came as a result of qualitative research among 3 Pentecostal churches in Sydney. And I'm particularly interested in bringing the data into conversation with the work of missiologists and the concept of the Missio Dei, the mission of God, which frames mission in the church in terms of God's initiative, the sending Father who sent Jesus, and then the Spirit here on earth. And this whole concept looks at mission from the perspective of what God is already doing. If God is a missionary God, then the role of the church becomes to see what the Spirit is already doing in the church and in communities and to discern it and then to cooperate with it. So first of all, let me introduce you to the project itself. As I said, it comes from the field of practical theology, and it draws specifically on the theories of Mark Cartledge's dialectical model and his use of testimonies, Jeff Astley's theory of ordinary theology, and David Martin's work on rescripting. And simply that just meant looking at the ordinary theology of Christians as they reflected on their experiences and looking for the themes and patterns in their experience and in their reflections, and then bringing them into dialogue with academic voices. The value of this approach is that it takes into serious consideration the thoughts and practices and reflections of ordinary everyday people within the context of their local context, rather than just considering the abstract theories outside of them. I think that's what I appreciated about this approach the most. And when we look at the patterns and the principles that come out and then we compare them with the academic voices, we can start to see where are the differences, where are the similarities, and both can be taken into account into the rescription process. The 3 churches I studied were all Pentecostal churches. They all had that approach to practice and theology about what they anticipated in ordinary church life, that it would emulate that of the early church, and that we could hear God's voice in the same way that the biblical characters did in the book of Acts and the New Testament. The research involved a whole host of semi-structured interviews. I think I did around about 65 individual interviews, a range of focus groups, and then 6 to 8 weeks of participant observation in each of the 3 churches. So what did the findings reveal? Let me share the key themes for you. There were 6 main outcomes of the revelatory experience. The first one, and the most common one, was that the experience of hearing from the voice of the Spirit for participants was to build a personal relationship with God. And this relationship was very much based on the dynamic of 2-way communication. If God was personal, if God loved me, then he would speak to me about what is going on in my life. And so most of the experiences were very much centered on family and career and what's going on in people's lives, finances, all personal issues. And this was understood to be the product of a personal God who cared about the individual and cared about their life, and as a result built a relationship with the person. The second function of revelatory experience was to provide a vehicle for experiencing the felt presence of God. So in this way, it acted as a kind of an apologetic. And so we saw experiences where God spoke into the future perhaps, and then it came to pass, or God spoke about an area that was unknown. And for the person who was receiving that, they felt like this was amazing because it showed them that God was real. It instilled a sense of wonder and of awe, a little bit like Paul described in 1 Corinthians, that sense of God is really among us. The third function of the experience was to provide practical care and protection, and this operated in very practical ways. For example, God spoke about an impending lawsuit. God spoke to stop a person from committing suicide. God spoke to protect someone from stepping out into the traffic or a fire being in the home. So there were multiple experiences. One that I remember is a young woman who was about to go into brain surgery because they had discovered a problem in her brain, and she said the Spirit spoke to her and said that the x-ray had been misread. And when she confronted the doctor, who was a bit taken aback, an hour later they came back and vindicated what she said, and she didn't have to go through brain surgery. So just examples of divine care and protection. Fourthly, the experience functioned to initiate a process of personal transformation. And the experience itself acted as a change agent, providing the motivation and impetus for personal growth and changes in behaviour. So there were a lot of experiences and testimonies about healing from emotional wounds, issues of self-esteem, problems with relationship, leadership ability, areas of moral change. So someone was being called to forgive their partner, to be more generous to someone else. So very much related to sanctification processes. A fifth function was to reveal God's plan for someone's life. And so people shared stories about how God was calling them to change careers or move location, or to call them into a different direction than perhaps that they had have planned. Finally, a sixth function was to mobilize respondents to church and mission-related activity. And this again was a whole host of different types of experiences. People were being called to go to church, to volunteer and be involved with local welfare agencies. They were being called to foster a child, work with the homeless, go on a mission trip to India, plant a church, start an outreach course, or even simple things like talking to a neighbour or being kind to the person at the gym. So the Spirit was seen to be doing a whole range of activities in people's lives. I think one of the things that stood out in the study was just how significant many of these experiences were to the individuals, such that if they hadn't had this experience, they wouldn't have then changed their behaviour in all these areas. So let me bring those findings into dialogue with the voice of missiologists. And I've chosen a missiologist called Craig Van Gelder. And what Van Gelder does is he takes a closer look at the Missio Dei, the role of the Spirit in mission, by looking at the activities of the New Testament church in the book of Acts and in the epistles, and he basically surveys all those activities and summarizes them and outlines them using 5 different dimensions. So he says the role of the Spirit acts in the church to create a new type of reconciled community with one identity in Christ. Number 2, the Spirit empowers leadership to guide the community. Number 3, the Spirit leads people into sanctified living, consistent with a new nature in Christ. Number 4, the Spirit leads people into active ministry for the sake of others in the church and in the world based on gifting. And number 5, the Spirit leads people into the world to unmask principalities and powers so that these powers may come to know the wisdom of God. He very much emphasizes that the work of the Spirit in the early church is to bring growth of the church, to bring development, to bring outreach, such that the church is transformed and then mobilized to reach the rest of society. So he puts an emphasis on the role of the Spirit and calls the church as a result to really discern what the Spirit is doing and then to cooperate with it. In bringing the work of Van Gelder together with the findings of my study, I think it's important to consider the different understandings about what hearing God's voice is. So Van Gelder, he comes from a conservative evangelical tradition, and he sees that the discerning of the work of the Spirit is mainly related to reading the scriptures and understanding what God is doing in general, and then looking at the circumstances around to pick up on the themes of what God may be doing, which is different to the Pentecostals in the study, who understood revelation to come perhaps through these direct Spirit encounters. And so you do have a different starting point about how the Spirit reveals what God's heart is. However, the outcomes, what we really want to focus on to see where is the overlap and how does that work. So what we see when we bring those 2 voices together, the voice of the academy and the ordinary theology of participants in the study, is that there is considerable overlap in what the Spirit is doing. In fact, all 5 dimensions of Van Gelder's work can be seen in the study. We saw that experiences help to build relationships within the life of the church. They provided the impetus for sanctified living and transformation. They included calls to ministry at both lay and vocational levels. They precipitated outreach and missionary activities within the life of the church and the community. The data clearly supports Van Gelder's supposition that the Spirit is doing the work of changing lives and transforming communities. You know, I remember talking with one lady, her name was Elizabeth, and she started to tell a story about how one night she was falling asleep and she has this vision in her mind's eye, and she sees a heart, and it's very dark and grey, and in the middle of the heart there's a bleeding wound. She said then she saw this large hand reaching out and touching the wound. And she said, when I woke up the next morning, I realised what it was all about, because 20 years earlier she had gone through a very difficult divorce and had really suffered through the loss of her daughter in that process. And she said that when she woke up from the vision for the first time, she felt free of the pain of that. Even though she had tried to cover it up for 20 years, suddenly she felt free of it and began to understand that for her, the Spirit was working and speaking to bring healing. And that theme was seen throughout the revelatory experiences in the study. But the work of the Spirit wasn't just seen to be introspective in that sense. It extended towards others as well. And I've highlighted 3 themes that I saw in the missional outcomes of the revelatory work of the Spirit: motivation, direction, and strategy. The first one is motivation. And this is where we saw that the Spirit was working to bring personal transformation and sanctification and healing. But that process didn't just stop there. It actually worked to mobilize people so that the sanctification and the transformation then enabled them to be motivated to reach out to other people. The new nature that God was producing also brought transformation in that people were motivated to hear from God and then to give to others. It's interesting that research backed up the work of sociologist Margaret Paloma, who's done a lot of work in America, and she and John Green, another sociologist, looked at the impact of revelatory experience and found that because the individuals had experienced this sense of energy and of love, they were then empowered to give more, to show more benevolence, to pray for others, to volunteer more, and actually to reach out to other people around them. So it provided the motivation. The second thing is it provided specific direction. And this was a really interesting one for me because many of the respondents talked about the otherness of God's voice. The Spirit spoke to say things that they didn't expect. One lady talked about how the Spirit spoke to her about fostering a child, and as a single woman, she had never contemplated the possibility. Another man heard the Spirit say to work in children's ministry, and again, he was not interested. And then he said he found himself in that place doing something which he felt like he'd been called to do for all of his life. And so the Spirit was speaking to give people specific direction about moving into areas of mission and outreach and service that they never would have thought to do. Finally, the third aspect of it was the sense of strategy. And again, very much similar, the Spirit was speaking to give specific strategies to people who were reaching out to others. Perhaps they'd hit an obstacle, or they didn't know how to access resource, or they didn't know where to go or who to speak to, and they heard the Spirit speaking specific instructions about how to enact works of mission. The Spirit was speaking to outwork the mission of God. But one of the other interesting elements of the study is that the experience itself wasn't always connected to the mission of God. People often would think that the Spirit would speak about their own personal issues. But when we frame it in the sense of the broader mission of God, this was a way of understanding what was happening that would have been helpful for people. And in terms of the Pentecostal experience, would mitigate against some of the problems that we've often seen in the Pentecostal church, where these kind of experiences can become sensationalistic and self-serving and subject to manipulation and fallout. But when we understand them in terms of the broader perspective, that the Spirit speaks to continue the mission of Jesus, as Jesus said when he said, "When I leave, I'm going to send you my Spirit." My Spirit, in John 14, he says, will remind you of everything I've spoken. And because I've got so much more to tell you and I can't tell you it all now, I'm going to send my Spirit. My Spirit will then speak about things to come. And as in the early church, the Spirit spoke to bring growth and development and strategy. We saw that happening in the participants of the study, that the Spirit was continuing the mission of God in 21st century Sydney, Australia. Thank you.